The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Judge Raymond Foster, an authoritative man in his 60s, adjusted his glasses and prepared to deliver the final ruling. The entire town had followed the case closely, their opinions divided. Mr. Carter, the accused, sat motionless at the defendant's table, his fate seemingly sealed. Ms. Donovan, the prosecutor, stood confidently, certain of the verdict, while Mr. Holloway, the defense attorney, kept his gaze fixed on the judge, gripping his notes tightly. Every spectator held their breath, waiting for the gavel to drop and the ruling to be declared. Then a voice shattered the silence. "Stop the trial, sir. I have something to say." Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned, searching for the source of the interruption. Standing in the gallery was Ethan Miller, a nervous 12-year-old boy, his face flushed, his hands trembling. His mother reached out to pull him down, whispering urgently, but Ethan stood his ground. The judge's stern gaze settled on the boy. "Young man, this is highly inappropriate. Sit down at once." Ethan swallowed hard but did not move. "Please, sir, I know something important. It changes everything." A murmur spread through the crowd like a wave. The weight of Ethan's words was undeniable. The judge exhaled, considering the situation carefully. Finally, he motioned toward the front. "Approach the bench." Ethan's legs felt like lead as he walked past rows of shocked spectators. He reached the front and stood before the judge, his heart pounding, the gravity of the moment pressing against his chest. "Tell me, Ethan," the judge said, his voice softer now. "What do you know?" Ethan hesitated, glancing at Mr. Holloway, who gave him an encouraging nod. He then turned to Ms. Donovan, who watched him warily, arms crossed. Taking a deep breath, Ethan steadied himself. "I was at the park that night," he said. "The night Mr. Carter was supposed to have killed Mr. Lewis. I saw something." A ripple of shock coursed through the room. Mr. Carter, who had remained silent throughout most of the trial, lifted his head, his eyes searching Ethan's face. The courtroom held its collective breath. Judge Foster leaned forward. "And what exactly did you see?" The town of Millhaven had always been quiet, a place where neighbors knew each other and crime was almost unheard of. That was until Alyssa Green was murdered. The news sent shockwaves through the small community, leaving people shaken and afraid. Rumors spread quickly, twisting and turning with every whispered conversation. Who could have done something so terrible? The police wasted no time in making an arrest. Lucas Hart, Alyssa's boyfriend, was taken into custody, his face splashed across every newspaper and television screen in town. The evidence against him was thin, circumstantial at best, but the town needed a suspect, someone to blame for the horror that had shattered their sense of safety. Many believed he was guilty, but not everyone. Ethan Miller had been following the case closely. He had always been an observant kid, noticing the little details that others overlooked. And there was something about this case that didn't sit right with him. He had seen Lucas that night, but he hadn't been with Alyssa. He had been arguing with another woman. The memory replayed in Ethan's mind over and over. He had been riding his bike near the old train tracks when he spotted Lucas under the dim glow of a street lamp. His voice had been raised, his hands clenched into fists. The woman he was arguing with had her back to Ethan, but there was something in the way she stood, the way her head tilted ever so slightly, that made Ethan uneasy. It wasn't Alyssa. He was sure of it. Yet no one had mentioned another woman in the investigation. The police reports, the news articles, even the courtroom testimonies, none of them acknowledged what Ethan had seen. He wondered if anyone else had noticed, if anyone else had asked the same questions that now consumed his thoughts. Doubt gnawed at him, but fear held him back. Who would believe a 12-year-old boy? Would they even listen? He had tried to tell his parents, but they dismissed him, saying he was imagining things. Even his friends thought he was overthinking it. But Ethan knew what he saw, and the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Lucas wasn't the one responsible. Each night, he lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He wanted to speak up, to say something, but the idea of standing in a courtroom, of facing adults who would scrutinize his every word, terrified him. Still, the image of Lucas sitting in that jail cell, accused of a crime he might not have committed, haunted him. The trial moved quickly. The prosecution painted Lucas as a jealous, possessive boyfriend who had lashed out in a fit of rage. The defense argued that there was no concrete evidence linking him to the murder, only speculation and assumption. But as the trial neared its end, it seemed inevitable that Lucas would be convicted. Then came the moment Ethan had been dreading, the moment he knew he couldn't stay silent anymore. The judge was preparing to deliver the final ruling when Ethan, heart hammering in his chest, pushed himself to his feet. Ethan sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding, as he watched Lucas Hart sitting at the defense table. The weight of the truth pressed on his chest like a heavy stone. The trial was nearing its end, and soon Lucas would be convicted for a crime he didn't commit. Ethan knew what he had seen. He knew the truth. But fear had kept him silent. For days, he had debated whether to come forward. He was just a kid. Who would believe him? He had overheard his parents discussing the case in hushed tones, convinced of Lucas's guilt like everyone else. Even when Ethan tried to tell them what he had seen, they brushed him off, saying the police knew what they were doing. But they didn't know everything. They didn't know about the blonde woman. Ethan's hands tightened into fists. He had seen Lucas that night, but not with Alyssa. He had seen him arguing with a blonde woman near the old train tracks. The way she had gestured aggressively, the way Lucas had tried to calm her down, it had stayed with him. And yet no one else had mentioned her. The police never brought her up. Had they even looked for her? The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized the answer. They hadn't. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to read the final ruling. The moment had come. If Ethan didn't speak now, it would be too late. His pulse thundered in his ears as he stood up. Lucas didn't do it. I know who did. Gasps rippled through the room. Every head turned toward him. His mother's eyes widened in horror, and she reached for his arm, but he took a step forward, determined. The judge's gaze settled on him, calm but probing. And who would that be, young man? Ethan took a deep breath, his hands shaking at his sides. It was a blonde woman. I saw her arguing with Lucas that night. A stunned silence followed. Ethan could feel the heat of the prosecutor's glare, the disbelief from the jurors, the murmurs of the spectators. He glanced at Lucas, who looked just as shocked as everyone else. The defense attorney, Mr. Holloway, straightened in his chair, his mind already working through this unexpected revelation. Ms. Donovan, the prosecutor, adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. The boy's testimony has not been vetted. Judge Foster studied Ethan for a long moment. That may be, but we cannot ignore it. Approach the bench." Ethan swallowed hard, his legs feeling like lead as he stepped forward. He knew there was no turning back now. The truth was out. And whether the court believed him or not, he had done what he had to do. Lucas Hart's fate, perhaps the entire trial, had just changed forever. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as people exchanged bewildered glances. The prosecutor, Miss Donovan, scoffed, shaking her head. "That's ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice laced with skepticism. "A 12-year-old boy's testimony is hardly credible. He could have seen anyone." Ethan's face burned, but he held his ground. "I know what I saw," he said firmly. "And I remember something else. She had a keychain with the initials AG. It wasn't Alyssa. She had a sister." Silence fell over the room. The defense attorney, Mr. Holloway, furrowed his brow and hastily flipped through his case files. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. The spectators shifted in their seats, waiting for someone to break the tense stillness. Mr. Holloway's eyes widened as he landed on a document buried in his folder. His voice was low but urgent. "Alyssa's sister, Amanda Green." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The revelation sent an electric charge through the courtroom. Miss Donovan stiffened, her confidence wavering for the first time since the trial began. The judge rapped his gavel twice. "Order! Order in the court!" His gaze settled on Ethan. "Young man, are you certain of this?" Ethan nodded, his pulse racing. "I saw her that night. She was the one arguing with Lucas, not Alyssa." The room erupted again, but this time the energy had shifted. The weight of Ethan's words settled over the jurors, the spectators, and most importantly, the judge. "Enough," the judge declared, his tone decisive. "This changes everything. I am calling a recess. Officers, bring in Amanda Green for questioning immediately." Bailiffs moved swiftly, disappearing through the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom buzzed with hushed speculation, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Lucas, still seated at the defense table, let out a shaky breath, his expression caught between hope and disbelief. Miss Donovan turned to the judge, attempting to regain control. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The trial is now in question," Judge Foster interrupted. "If new evidence is coming to light, we must investigate." Ethan stood frozen as the reality of what he had just done settled in. The truth was unraveling. He had set something in motion, and there was no stopping it now. As he looked around, he saw Amanda Green's name now lingering on everyone's lips. And for the first time since the trial began, doubt clouded the certainty of Lucas Hart's guilt. The investigation into Amanda Green escalated quickly. Within hours, law enforcement executed a search warrant at her home. What they found left no room for doubt. Hidden in the back of her closet was a diary, its pages filled with obsessive, angry entries about Alyssa. The most damning page of all detailed a twisted plan. How she had lured her sister to the park that night, how she had planned every step, and how she intended to make Lucas Hart take the fall. The courtroom was silent when the evidence was presented. The judge's face remained unreadable as he read through the diary entries. The prosecution had no argument left to make. Amanda Green was guilty. Ethan sat frozen in his seat, the weight of his actions fully sinking in. He had known something was wrong, but he never expected it to be this dark, this calculated. His testimony had changed the course of the trial, had saved Lucas from being wrongfully convicted. And yet, as Amanda was brought into the courtroom in handcuffs, he couldn't shake the cold fear creeping up his spine. She turned to him as she passed, her eyes burning with something dangerous. Her lips curled into a bitter smirk. "You should have stayed quiet." A shiver ran through Ethan, but he didn't look away. He had done the right thing, even if it meant making an enemy. The judge's gavel struck the desk. "Amanda Green, you are hereby placed under arrest for the murder of Alyssa Green and obstruction of justice. Court is adjourned." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, a mix of shock and relief sweeping through the crowd. Lucas exhaled, his hands shaking as he covered his face. He had been moments away from losing everything, from spending a lifetime in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Now, because of Ethan, he was free. Mr. Holloway patted Ethan on the shoulder. "You did something brave today." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. His heart was still pounding. He wasn't a hero. He had just spoken the truth. But sometimes, telling the truth was the hardest thing to do. As Amanda was led away, her gaze lingered on him one last time before she disappeared through the doors. The weight of her words hung in the air, but Ethan refused to let them shake him. He had done what was right, no matter the consequences. As the courtroom emptied, his mother pulled him into a tight hug, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you." For the first time since the trial had begun, Ethan felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. The truth had come out. Justice had been served. And even though he had been afraid, he had faced it anyway. Ethan sat quietly in the courtroom as the weight of the past few days settled over him. The chaos had finally died down, but the impact of what had happened remained. He had spoken the truth when it mattered most, and because of that, an innocent man was free. But what Ethan hadn't expected was how much his actions would expose. The cracks in the justice system, the mistakes that could have cost Lucas Hart his life. The judge looked down at Ethan, his expression solemn yet filled with admiration. "You saved a man's life today," he said. "Few people, let alone a 12-year-old, would have had the courage to do what you did." Ethan swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He hadn't done it for praise. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. Yet, hearing those words made him realize just how much power the truth held, how easily it could have been buried if he had stayed silent. As the courtroom emptied, the people of Millhaven, once skeptical of him, now saw him in a different light. Neighbors who had whispered behind his back now approached him with quiet admiration. Some shook his hand, others simply nodded in acknowledgement. The town had been so sure of Lucas's guilt, so ready to let the trial play out without questioning the flaws in the case, but Ethan's bravery had forced them to see the truth. Lucas Hart walked over, his relief evident in his tired eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be standing here right now." Ethan gave a small nod. "You don't have to thank me. I just told the truth." Lucas smiled, shaking his head. "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." His family stood nearby, watching with pride. His mother, who had once begged him to stay quiet, now wiped away tears. His father gave him a firm pat on the back. They had been worried, afraid of what would happen if he spoke up. But now they saw that their son had done something incredible. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, eager to tell the story of the boy who had turned the case upside down. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, but Ethan didn't feel like a hero. He just felt like a kid who had done what needed to be done. The justice system had nearly failed Lucas. It had been so quick to convict, so quick to accept surface-level evidence without digging deeper. If Ethan hadn't spoken up, an innocent man would have been sentenced for something he didn't do. It made Ethan wonder how many other people had been wrongfully accused. How many others had been silenced because no one believed them. As he left the courthouse, his mother wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You did something amazing today," she whispered. and we couldn't be prouder. Ethan glanced at the town, at the people who now saw him differently. He didn't feel like a hero, but he knew that standing up for what was right had made all the difference. Sometimes it only took one voice to change everything. Ethan had interrupted a courtroom, exposed a secret, and changed lives forever. He had never expected to be at the center of such a momentous event, but when the truth was at stake, he had found the courage to speak. The impact of his words rippled far beyond what he had imagined. He had not just saved Lucas' heart, he had revealed the flaws in a system that was meant to deliver justice. As he walked out of the courthouse, the weight of everything settled over him. People who had doubted him, dismissed him, now looked at him differently. He was no longer just the quiet boy who sat in the back. He had become the one who saved the day. His family stood proudly beside him, their expressions a mix of relief and admiration. His mother, who had once feared for him speaking up, now squeezed his shoulder, tears glistening in her eyes. His father gave him a nod of approval, silent but meaningful. The judge's words echoed in Ethan's mind. "You saved a man's life today." It had been terrifying to step forward, to speak against expectations, but now he understood why it had mattered so much. The truth had needed to be heard, and sometimes it took someone unexpected to make sure it was. Reporters surrounded them, cameras flashing, microphones pressing forward. The town, once skeptical, now whispered about his bravery. Some called him a hero. But Ethan didn't feel like one. He had simply done what was right. The case had proven how easily assumptions could replace facts, how quickly people were willing to accept what was presented to them. If Ethan had stayed quiet, Lucas would have gone to prison for a crime he didn't commit. If no one had questioned the evidence, the real murderer would have walked free. The truth had been buried, until Ethan forced the world to see it. As he looked around, he saw the power of his decision reflected in the faces of those watching him. One person could make a difference. One voice, no matter how small, could change everything, because sometimes the truth can only be revealed by those who dare to speak it.